Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our webinar. I hope you can see my screen now. Madeleine, can everybody see my screen? Yeah. So welcome to the webinar, How Can Europe Support Brazil in Overcoming its Current Humanitarian and Environmental Crisis? Before we start, I would like to share some organizational and technical information with you. So we would like to know who you are. So please add your name and organization, institution. To do so in your frame, you click on the blue rectangle with the 3 white dots, or you can rename yourself in the participants list with a right mouse click. So it's easy that everybody knows who is there and who we are. And you can also actively participate in our webinar and use the chat function and also the Q&A section. So please ask your question and name the person you are asking. And if you want to affirm a question, you can support it with your thumb up. It's also right in the section, you can see it when we ask the first question. Maybe one of my colleagues can just ask a question to show you. There's an open question and you can click on the thumb to say, oh yeah, that's an interesting question, I want to support it. And one more information, we are going to record the webinar. I hope there's nothing against it. It's also interesting to have it later. We are live streaming it as well, and later it is interesting for others to see it. My colleagues Madeleine Lebion and Jana Veit and me, we are going to support you during the whole session. So any question or need of support, do not hesitate to contact us via the chat or via the Q&A section. There will be live tweeting, as I said. There will be a posting and a streaming on Facebook. So you are very much invited to follow us there and be active yourself on social media. So here you see the Twitter and the Facebook link. And yeah, so I'm giving the floor to Thomas, our moderator, and we are happy to have you all here with us. Thank you. So Thomas, please.
Yeah, here I am. Thank you very much, Silke, for the introduction on the technical issues. So also welcome from my side to our webinar. This is a joint event of Climate Alliance, Rainforest Foundation Norway, Society for Threatened People, and the Network for the Ratification of the ILO Convention 169. My name is Thomas Brose. I will moderate this meeting. I'm the director of Climate Alliance, an European city network with more than 1,700 cities and regions as members in partnership with COICA, the umbrella organization of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon basin. Our attention to the Amazonian region and the situation of the indigenous peoples is tied up by increasingly frequent emergencies. While last year it was the political firestorms, especially in Brazil, but also in Peru and Bolivia, this year it is the Corona crisis. At the moment, most of the organizations are busy following the infection figures, buying masks and distributing food packages. Although the overcoming of this emergency situation is crucial, in today's discussion, we wanted to focus on what is happening in the shadow of the crisis and is not in the daily focus of media and public attention, and will have long-term effects, not only for the nature, but also for the people in the Amazon region. So it is about some of the political consequences of Corona times. One example how the crisis is being used by political actors, not only in Brazil, to bypass environmental protection and soften laws, is the publication of a ministerial meeting of the Brazilian government. At this meeting, President Bolsonaro, besides many insults to the constitutional bodies, also demanded that the population be armed. His motto, "Armed people will never be enslaved." We would like to fade in the unmasking speech of the Brazilian Environment Minister during this meeting to show the force that we are dealing with. After the short presentation of this video, Truls Gulofsen from Rainforest Foundation, with whom we organized this meeting, will give a short introduction into the topic. So please, if we can have a look in this video.
Can you see the video, the picture?
Yes.
Okay, I'll now press play. This is 1.5 minutes from the Brazilian governmental meeting in April that was released.
Então, para isso precisa ter esforço nosso aqui, enquanto estamos nesse momento de tranquilidade no aspecto de cobertura de imprensa, porque só fala de Covid, e ir passando a boiada, e mudando todo o regramento, e simplificando normas de IFAM, de Ministério da Agricultura, de Ministério do Meio Ambiente, de Ministério disso, de Ministério daquilo. Agora é a hora de unir esforços para dar de baseada a simplificação regulatória que nós precisamos, em todos os aspectos. E deixar a AGU, o André não está aí, né? E deixar a AGU de stand-by para cada pau que tiver, porque vai ter. Essa semana mesmo nós assinamos uma medida a pedido do Ministério da Agricultura, que foi a simplificação da lei da Mata Atlântica para usar o Código Florestal. Hoje já está nos jornais dizendo que vão entrar com ações judiciais e ação civil pública no Brasil inteiro contra a medida. Então, para isso, nós temos que estar com a artilharia da AGU preparada para cada linha que a gente avança. Mas tem uma lista enorme em todos os ministérios que têm papel regulatório aqui para simplificar. Não precisamos de Congresso. E coisa que precisa de Congresso também, nesse fuzuê que está aí, nós não vamos conseguir aprovar. Agora tem um monte de coisa que é só parecer caneta, parecer caneta. Sem parecer também não tem caneta, porque dar canetada sem parecer é cana. Então, isso aí vale muito a pena. A gente tem um espaço enorme para fazer.
So, I hope everyone saw the video and could, those that understand Portuguese could understand that this was a real video from a real meeting and that the texting that we have done to English was helpful. To me, this is the clearest example of what Naomi Klein called the shock doctrine, how to use chaos to run down established democratic systems and structures. And it makes me very scared as a foreigner of what is happening in Brazil, not only with the virus situation, but also in terms of the rampant deforestation. We saw the fires last year that was a result of massively increased deforestation and reduced enforcement of environmental law. And we're seeing the same type of numbers so far this year. And we're seeing this evidence of lack of political will to try to control it, rather the opposite, by using the virus situation as leverage to let the cattle through the forest, which is dangerous. Which is why we are so happy that we now get the proper perspective from real Brazilians in this webinar to discuss what the real situation is, also behind the shadow of the COVID crisis, and what we in Europe can possibly do to help. So I'm very, very happy that we have Brazilian friends that will now outline this, and that we have a very strong panel of European response that can discuss what we can do to help, because this cannot go on unabated.
Yeah, thank you very much, Truls, for this introduction. I think without any delay, we will go now to hear our first panelist. Maybe a short information how the agenda will be. So we will have 3 short interventions from our Brazilian colleagues, followed by comments from 2 MEPs that we are also very happy to welcome here during this meeting. I will present each of them just before their intervention so that you know who is participating. After the presentations, and this is, we are very happy to have this special guest here, Marina Silva will comment on the topics. And yeah, I hope that we will then have an overall political comment on this situation. I would like now to switch to Portuguese. Eu espero que todos estejam me escutando. Eu gostaria de aproveitar esta oportunidade para dar as boas-vindas a todos os colegas brasileiros e dizer que estamos muito felizes por tê-los hoje nesse evento que estamos participando. Muito obrigado pela participação de vocês. Okay, so we will start now with the first panelist. I would like to announce Marcio Astrini. He is the Executive Secretary of the Climate Observatório, which is the leading civil society network for climate and forest protection in Brazil, representing more than 50 member organizations. Before moving to the Climate Observatory, Astrini worked for 13 years at Greenpeace Brazil, where he coordinated its Amazon and climate and public policy campaigns. So, Marcio, you have the floor.
Olá, bom dia e boa tarde também para todos. Eu quero inicialmente agradecer o convite da Climate Alliance, da Rainforest. É um prazer estar aqui com vocês hoje. Eu tenho 10 minutos para apresentar o contexto do Brasil e alguns inputs sobre como seria um trabalho conjunto, ou como fazermos um melhor trabalho conjunto.
Work together in the future in face of this current situation. 10 minutes to explain what is going in Brazil is a real challenge, as you can imagine. So I brought a little presentation so that I won't speak too much. And therefore I will now share my screen. I will try to be quite concise. Hello to everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here with you. So the first message I would like to share with you and say it very clearly when we're talking about Brazil right now is that the situation in reality is worse, a lot worse than what you hear about in the news when you're outside of Brazil. When people think about what's going on in Brazil, forget the former governments we had here. Don't compare the current moment or the current government with other moments we've had in the recent democratic period. We are living through a never heard of period. It's very new with this Bolsonaro government. The first big change is that this is a government that has no appreciation for democracy. He's an enemy of democracy. He sees democracy as his enemy, something that needs to be changed. Very seldom the Bolsonaro government, so the Bolsonaro government inspires itself, orients itself with Orbán's government in Hungary, for example. He would like to compare himself. And I think I need to go back and talk to talk about democracy, because the defense of environment, of indigenous rights, of nature can only be done in a democratic situation. Democracy being at risk makes the situation much worse. So this government wants to diminish the democratic space in Brazil. To give you an example, Bolsonaro's government participated in demonstrations asking for the shutdown of the Brazilian Supreme Court and asking for the shutdown of the Brazilian parliament. He's constantly attacking the press and the media, constantly attacking indigenous populations, vulnerable populations, scientists, environmentalists, NGOs. I could continue with my list of his attacks towards civil society. Talking from the point of view of the environment, President Bolsonaro declared himself, or declared that the environment is the enemy of his administration. There are several negationists, climate negationists in his government that do not believe in climate change. Some of his ministers, for example, the Minister for International Affairs, declared that in Brazil, environment is some sort of international conspiracy directed against the country, supposedly. So we are not discussing climate change with the Brazilian government. That's not the discussion we're having right now. The discussion that we are having amongst organizations is, will we be able to continue to work in Brazil? It's very basic. People working with issues regarding human rights or environmental issues or data transparency. Will we be able to continue to work, and for how long? Because there's a very clear position from the government against this sector. So our question today in Brazil is, what is the next attack from the president against the indigenous rights going to be? The president will try to finish off with the reserves, but the discussion goes much further. It's even more dramatic than what you see or what you read when you're not living in Brazil. There was always a big risk in Brazil regarding environmental protection, but right now the situation is actually absurd, and there is a larger risk than ever because democracy itself is at risk. We don't know what to expect, what is going to happen in the next months in Brazil. So this is a slide with different blocks showing the backward steps that have happened in the last period. Even after the announcement of the trade deal with the European Union. So this is a government that, regarding participation, political participation, regarding control, vigilance of what is going on in the Amazon, threatens the indigenous areas, that is logging, that will log more, that has signed off from all climate policies that Brazil had ever signed, and are trying to meddle and interfere in international climate discussions. And they are actively threaten indigenous populations and their rights. This is a very brief resume of the anti-environmental climate, anti-environment policies we have in Brazil right now. What I wanted to tell you quickly is that the agreement, MERCOSUL and the European Union, the trade agreement, will never change or educate the Bolsonaro government. I know that this is a belief that many of us had last year when the agreement was signed, that political pressure like this agreement could maybe change his actions or the government's actions. But unfortunately, that will not be the case. The signing of this agreement, MERCOSUL and the European Union, will be used by the Bolsonaro government. He will, so to speak, tell his people that this is a proof that what he's doing is correct, that this is a seal of approval, that all of his actions did not lead to Europe not signing the trade agreement. And therefore, all the people working on environmental issues, on indigenous rights, are exaggerating, and that things in Brazil are not as bad as portrayed by civil society. We really wish it were possible to have Bolsonaro change his policies thanks to a treaty like this. But unfortunately, that will not happen. Bolsonaro's government has a plan, and they want to implement an authoritarian regime in Brazil. They want to destroy the environment in Brazil. It's a plan against the indigenous communities and the most fragile communities. It is not a democratic plan. It is not an environmentally friendly plan. And unfortunately, this government will not change. What I suggest now, and I hope we'll have the occasion to discuss this more in depth, is that we create, maybe starting today with this webinar, let's create a sort of discourse, permanent discourse, so that we can keep giving you updates on what is happening in Brazil, send you these updates, send you these information, send you the scientific research that we are doing, and discuss strategies regarding the next steps, so that we can spread the news, and that news should be sent to people in strategic positions in Brazil, so that we can influence, where it is possible, influence Brazilian policy making to neutralize the harm that the government is doing. Europe has a big role to play. Europe is very important. Europe's politics and Europe's enterprises can maybe neutralize this agenda of steps backwards from the Brazilian government. Let me give you two examples. Last year, the president of the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil took a trip, went to Europe, spoke with lots of parliamentarians and entrepreneurs in Europe, and came back to Brazil with a much finer knowledge of environmental agendas, and he actually declared that he would not have a vote in Congress on laws that would mean a step backwards for environmental legislation. And that thanks to the discussions he had had in Europe with politicians in Europe and with entrepreneurs in Europe. And that was a great help for us. So what you say, what civil society, parliamentarians, what investors in Europe do and say is very important for what is going on in Brazil today. And that's the main message I would like to pass here. In Brazil right now, we are all united, not with the idea of changing Bolsonaro into something he will never be, into changing him into a pro-democratic person, someone who will respect the environment. Unfortunately, that is impossible, will never happen. What we need now is to emphasize in avoiding and neutralizing Bolsonaro's policies, politics, and of destruction and setbacks for the environment and for democracy. We need to neutralize. I'm sorry, I lost Marcio. I can't hear Marcio anymore.
I think there is a problem, a technical problem with Marcio. Marcio? Oh. Okay, thank you very much, Marcio. I think there was a technical problem at the end. So your last two sentences, I think we couldn't hear. But I think the main message was delivered. Thank you very much for this not very positive picture of the situation in Brazil. But I think it's important to have this clarity. At the same time, thank you also for the hints what we can do here from Europe. I understand that the strengthening of the cooperation, networking, and especially the organizations in Brazil, it's a very important strategy for the future. So I would like, before going to the next panelist, I would like to say that we have now around more than 110 participants in this meeting coming from different countries. We have a participant from Kenya, from Africa. So I'm very happy that there is this interest in the exchanging information about the situation, which today is Brazil, but tomorrow can be another country. We will have the opportunity after the presentations to have a question round. So if you have any question, please use the chat where you can place your questions. Okay, I would like now to go to Kreta Kaingang for his presentation. He is from the Mangueirinha indigenous land, an area of Atlantic forest and the countryside of Paraná in the south of Brazil. This community is continuously threatened by loggers. In April 2003, Kreta and his people, the Kaingang, helped create the free land camp, the Acampamento Terra Livre in Brasilia, along with the Guarani and Xoleng peoples. Today, the camp is the largest forum of the Brazilian indigenous movement. He also initiated and led the indigenous battle against fracking in Brazil. He represents APIB, which is the national Brazilian indigenous organization with several regional organizations as part of this umbrella organization. And he is coordinator of APIB, the Articulation of the Indigenous People of the South. So, Kreta, please, you have the floor.
First of all, I would like to say hello to everybody. You already introduced me, Thomas. Us who were members part of the trip to Europe in October, November, denouncing the genocide that has happened with our peoples here in Brazil. The the burning of the Amazon forest, the attack of our territories by the illegal loggers, gold miners for planting soy and cattle area. And we were surprised that during the last ministerial meeting of Bolsonaro, the Minister of Environmental Affairs very clearly stated what his position was of how all the laws regarding environmental protection should be surpassed. The Bolsonaro government, ever since he was a candidate for presidency, he had declared war against us indigenous people. He was elected president and chose us as enemies to his government. And therefore he feels like he has to invade our territories. And when we traveled through Europe last year, we traveled to 12 different countries in October, November to talk about this genocidal policy. But what brings me here today is the MERCOSUL trade union agreement. If this trade union agreement between Latin America and Europe is signed, this will finance the war that Brazil is leading against us in the Amazon. The financing through this MERCOSUL treaty will reinforce the genocide being waged against us. The Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention will not be respected as it should. We, the indigenous people, will not be participating in democratic processes. Our territories, the boundaries of our territories will not be respected. Our leaders will be criminalized, are being criminalized, will be criminalized. And we are under attack. In Europe, we denounced that Bolsonaro was an enemy of the climate. He has a policy of pro-climate change, and it is very clear that we need you, that we need Europe. What does Europe want? You can't have two different policies. One of fighting against climate change and global warming, and at the same time financing the genocide of the traditional communities and the indigenous people, the rural workers in Brazil. The environmentalists, the destruction of the environmental organizations and structures, which will then favor the gold mining, the deforestation, will enslave our populations here in Brazil in favor of this market agreement that buys products here in Brazil that are products coming from areas invaded, our indigenous areas that are invaded by Bolsonaro and his people, the enemy of the climate. Last year, Bolsonaro was the enemy of the climate. This year, he's the enemy of public health worldwide. He's using the pandemic to go forth with his anti-democratic policies, the expansion of fascism in Brazil. Every minute, the fascists led by Bolsonaro are fighting constitutional rights. As for instance, the Supreme Court Congress, the instances that we have to defend our Constitution, to defend our rights, and democratic policies that might still exist in Brazil. So Europe needs to be aware of the fact that today is not the moment to ratify the MERCOSUL treaty agreement. This is not the time, because you would give him a seal of approval. You would give Bolsonaro's policies a seal of approval. Do not finance, do not approve the government, Bolsonaro, the Bolsonaro government. He is the enemy of the whole planet. Last year, he was waging war against climate. This year, he's waging war against public health and the climate. He is a worldwide enemy, and we have to unite to fight him. So Europe, don't have two different policies. And this policy is the one that preserves lives, preserves nature, and preserves the environment, protects quality of life in the whole planet. This is what I would like to share with you, and this is my message to the European Parliament. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Kreta, for this very impressive words. I think it's clear, your message, your question to Europe. If Europe wants to have a climate policy, this is not compatible with the violation of human rights. Climate policy is not only an environmental issue, it's a holistic approach which includes human rights, health, and all the other topics. So thank you very much. I just wanted to add again that you have the opportunity to make some questions. So we have the Q&A session. It's the button in on your screen, and then secondly, you have also the chat. But the Q&A area is where you can post your questions. Now I would like to introduce our third panelist from Brazil. This is Dinamam Tuxa. He is a representative of the Tuxa people, an indigenous people who lives in the states of Bahia, Pernambuco, and Minas Gerais. He is the coordinator of the Brazil's Indigenous Coalition, the already mentioned APIB, and a lawyer for the Articulation of Northeast Indigenous Peoples and Organizations of Minas Gerais and Espírito Santo. In addition to being an attorney, he also holds a master's degree in sustainable development from the university, and is a PhD candidate at the University of Brasilia. Dinamam, you have the floor, please.
Olá.
Hello. Hello to everybody who's here joining us today. In the name of APIB, I would like to thank you for making this dialogue possible, talking amongst us, and to denounce the situation for the indigenous people in Brazil. We are being attacked by two viruses, by the virus Bolsonaro and the coronavirus, which aggravates the Bolsonaro virus. The anti-indigenous, anti-environmental policies of the current government, the Bolsonaro government, is made worse through the coronavirus. Unfortunately, the loggers, the gold miners, the inviters, they along Unfortunately, we have not noticed a lessening of their actions, of these criminals, since coronavirus has appeared here. 64% of invasions of indigenous territories took place now, ever since the coronavirus hit the country. And that is a result of the policies of this government, who allows the invasion of the indigenous territories and the deforestation. Amongst this pandemic in Brazil, in the National Congress, they discussed laws that would give prizes to cattle herders, that would allow gold mining, that would allow deforestation, that would allow the attack on the indigenous population. The president has a responsibility, together with our Congress that is discussing measures against us, the MP 910, which we call the PL, authorizing public territories for speculation, opening the borders for agro-business of our territories, indigenous territories. What is very worrisome is that there is an agreement, treaty that is being discussed between MERCOSUL and Europe. We know that the indigenous population will be the ones to suffer the biggest impact with this treaty, because they will be disputing land, they will be disputing territories to feed these new markets. We know that 7% of meat production is directed toward the European market. Soy as well is directed to the European Union, is produced for the European Union. But this agreement will not respect legal precepts of human rights, will not respect human rights. It will not make sure that the rights, the human rights of the indigenous population will be protected. In the contrary, they will be under attack. Civil society and communities that are organized have to make sure that in their countries, in the European Union, we have to make sure that you can trace where the products that you are buying in Europe have been produced. You have to be able to penalize if these produces have been produced in regions that should be protected, ecosystems that should be protected by law. So this agreement is a threat to environment and to us, this agreement between the MERCOSUL and the European Union. What the two speakers before me, Marcio and Kreta, have already mentioned, they have mentioned the threats to our democracy. And our democracy is dying every day, because this politics, this policy that is being implemented right now is supposedly beneficial for the Brazilian population, but the most vulnerable populations, quilombolas, indigenous populations, are under attack. And those were one of the first measures of the Bolsonaro government. So we're in a very fragile situation, and it's an attack on our lives, us who we live depending on the Amazon, but the whole world, because we are the ones who directly protect the Amazon area, the Amazon rainforest. So if this agreement, MERCOSUL, European Union, you will be giving the seal of approval to a murder, to someone committing a genocide, because the Bolsonaro government is institutionalizing genocide. So if you will be congratulating a murderous government if you sign this treaty. And I have faith that the European community will not bathe their hands in blood in the name of the development of an authoritarian regime by signing this agreement. I think that is it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dinamam, for this clear message. I think it's important to acknowledge that what you said, that illegal logging companies are not working in home office, so they are continuing to destroy and this is what we have also to acknowledge, and also the clear message to Europe that I also agree that the European civil society will not accept what is going on in Brazil. So thank you very much for this introductions from our Brazilian participants. I would like now to go to additional comments from our MEPs. First, I would like to invite Mrs. Cavazzini. I'm happy to have you here again in one of our events. We had the pleasure to have you already in an event in Brussels last year. So Mrs. Cavazzini is a German politician of the Alliance 90 the Greens, serving as a member of the European Parliament since last year. She has since been serving on the Committee on International Trade. In addition to her committee assignment, she is part of the Parliament delegations for relations with Brazil and to the Euro-Latin American Parliamentary Assembly. She is also a member of the Responsible Business Conduct Working Group. I hope I have not forgot any of your functions. So, Mrs. Cavazzini, you have the floor, please.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you so much for the invitation and for organizing this important debate. Indeed, it's a lot of people who I've met in several debates in the last year, which just also shows how important the topic of deforestation in Brazil is also here in Brussels, because there are numerous debates, even more before Corona times, but I'm happy that also we're following this discussion digitally. And also let me just express my condolences to the Brazilian participants and panelists about the general situation of COVID-19 in Brazil. These news are really, really horrifying, and I hope that at least one good thing that came out of this is that the resistance against Bolsonaro is increasing. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about like two perspectives on what we just heard. One is how we as Europeans or members of the European Parliament can support the internal struggle in Brazil, because of course I think it is still the most important thing that opposition in the Congress, civil society, activists, and so on, try to fight Bolsonaro's destructive policy. And I think for us, I guess it is very important to have like this constant dialogue to see how the situation is really on the ground, and also kind of carrying this information to Europe, to the media, so that everyone is aware of what is happening in Brazil. And then of course also trying to, like, let's say, morally support all the important activities that are going on in Brazil on the ground. And then the second component or aspect I want to touch is, of course, what concretely we as parliamentarians or as European Union can do and are already doing. One thing is, of course, the normal government dialogues by national EU governments, but also the EU with the Brazilian government, for example, also the German ambassador, just like 3 days ago or something, the German ambassador in Brazil also got involved and made a very clear statement on the environmental politics and deforestation. And I think with these kind of public statements, also like EU governments can put pressure on the government. And then the second thing is, of course, also the question of like finances. I mean, I know it's also a very controversial debate. Do you cut finance? Do you give finance to other people, probably more to civil society? But I mean, in general, of course, there is also still for the last year some European funds going to Brazil. And I think the debate on how to really direct the finances in a way that it supports stopping deforestation and protecting the indigenous people and all the activists and so on is I think a crucial debate. We as European Parliament had originally planned to come to Brazil shortly before the COVID-19 crisis started, and I think also these kind of very personal visits on the ground can have an impact. Unfortunately, yeah, this was cancelled, but I think probably we're going to repeat it in the fall. We as Greens had for several months tried to put the agenda of deforestation in the Amazon region on the plenary agenda of the European Parliament. And this time with the kind support of also my colleague Kathleen, who was present here, and others, there was a broad consensus in the Conference of Presidents of the European Parliament to put the really catastrophic situation in Brazil on the plenary agenda. And actually on Friday morning, we're gonna have a debate in Brussels. And I think it would be probably really good to spread those news also widely in Brazil, because I think it can have some impact. And this was, of course, our goal with this initiative, to also show that there is a lot of concern in the European Parliament on what is happening now. You have probably seen that the British supermarkets have written a letter threatening the boycott of products from Brazil if this land grabbing legislation is really going to pass the Congress. And we copied this a little bit for the German context, and the biggest German campaign organization started a campaign on it, asking the German supermarkets to threaten with a boycott, basically. And now already more than in a very couple of days, very few days, more than 320,000 people signed this petition and signed this call, which is, I think, also a big success, and showing that a lot of citizens also really are concerned. Not only the politicians, but also a lot of citizens are concerned with what is going to, what is happening in Brazil. And again, Kathleen from Brempt and me, we are also preparing a common letter hopefully that will be signed by a lot of parliamentarians to basically our counterparts in the Congress, asking not to adopt this law that will legalize land grabbing, and also asking for reversing some of the environmental policy decisions, to also increase a little bit the pressure. And of course, last point I quickly wanted to make is that we as Europeans have a huge responsibility also on our economic relationships. I mean, the MERCOSUL agreement was mentioned several times, and we discussed it in other contexts, that it will this agreement will lead to higher pressure on the Amazon and will lead to more agro-industry agro-industrial production, and that's why we think it is clearly not a good agreement and should be stopped. But also in general, there's some very interesting processes going on in Europe at the moment on deforestation-free supply chains, and how to really implement due diligence along the supply chains. And this is interesting because it would at the end also basically lead to the fact that if a product is linked to deforestation, then it is much harder to import, or companies in Europe will have really a responsibility to include a liability that they cannot they have to make sure that their products don't lead to deforestation. So there is really also some legal initiatives on the way in Europe. I mean, this is more midterm because it will take more time. It's not for tomorrow, but it's a very, very interesting development, I think. And last point, what is also crucial for what Europe should do, we should really also try to decrease our dependency on the soy imports, because already now, even without any free trade agreement, we are like importing so many millions of tons of soy that also led to and are still leading to deforestation. And of course, for that, we need to reform a little bit our own agricultural model, because we're using it, of course, for feeding stuff for animals at the moment. And so this is also very important to reform the soy strategy. I would have much more to say, but I leave it here because we have a lot of panelists today, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mrs. Cavazzini, for this clear point, and also making clear, and I think this is important, that even without Corona and without Bolsonaro, we have a problem. So the problems didn't start with Bolsonaro. We had these problems also before, but also making clear what we can do here in Europe as consumers, but also as activists from the organizations supporting petitions, influencing the parliament, and doing what we are doing here, exchanging information. So thank you very much for this positive perspective in this difficult situation. As you already mentioned, we have also here Mrs. Kathleen from Van Brempt. So welcome also to our second MEP. Mrs. Van Brempt is currently also a member of the European Parliament for the Socialist Party, and leader of the local organization. And she was an MEP already from 2000 to 2003, when she was then elected State Secretary for Labor, Organization and Welfare in the Belgian government, and 2004 elected also Minister for Mobility, Social Economy and Equal Opportunities in the Flemish government. So a lot of political experience in the different levels, and we know that Belgium, it's not an easy country for a politician. But as MEP, as already mentioned, she also works in the mentioned committees and delegations. So thank you very much for being here with us, and you have the floor for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And just by mentioning Belgium, we still don't have a government, and we had a year ago elections. Just to comfort our Brazilian friends that there are also problems in Europe. But nevertheless, I'm blessed being a European. I'm very well aware of that. Having said that, first of all, let me thank all the organizations that organized this webinar for doing so. I think it's important now that we're more or less stuck at home. We still have to continue working and seeing and speaking to each other. And it's very, very important that we have the opportunity to speak to our Brazilian friends. And let me also be very clear and give the solidarity to the Brazilian people in these very difficult times. There's been huge crisis caused to Corona in Europe, but that's nothing compared to the challenges, I think, in Brazil. So I think it's very important, and I know all the attention will go that way for the time being. But afterwards, the other crisis, the climate crisis, will still be there. And that is of major concern of all of us. Maybe because someone gave the full update of everything that I've done, it's good to know that the last 10 years in the European Parliament, I spent all my energy on climate policy, but domestically. How can we improve and make sure that Europe gets a leadership domestically in tackling climate? And I think me, together with a lot of colleagues and people in the Commission, and I think we sort of got where we needed to be. We're not yet there, but starting with the Green New Deal in Europe, I think we're doing something extraordinary. We're going to decarbonize our economy by 2050, and we have a whole holistic approach in doing so. Why do I stress that? Because I did take the chance to change my portfolio in the European Parliament and go into the international trade, because I'm so concerned about how we deal as Europe with the rest of the world. And there will be no Green Deal if we're not possible to transform the Green Deal also in everything that we do externally. And first of all, that means international trade. So rest assured, it's on top of my mind to work on that. And you saw that from everything that Anna told you. I work very close together with her, especially on the MERCOSUL agreement. Let me, because of course, and thanks again for giving us an update of everything that's happening in Brazil. But you should know that Brazil is one of the best covered countries in our public opinion media, much more than Argentina, for instance, although Argentina is also part of the MERCOSUL agreement. Everything, or more or less, most of the things that Bolsonaro does are reported back in Europe, and that's good. That means that that we are well aware of what's happening, not in every detail, and that we need you and your support and your information to know much more when we start the discussion. So I think in Europe, more or less, the broad majority of the public opinion, but we will see the reflection in the European Parliament as well, would agree on the fact that Bolsonaro is an authoritarian, anti-democratic, woman-hating, racistic, climate denial, and I can go on for a very long time, president, and that is a huge problem. The question is, of course, and you also raised one of these issues, how can Europe be a friend to the Brazilian people, and how can Europe help you on the pathway, because we cannot elect your president. That's the work that you need to do, and I hope you will do that the next elections. That will make our life, especially the Brazilian people's life, but I think for the rest of the world, much more easy. But there's, of course, things that we can do, and let me say a few things about the MERCOSUL free trade agreement. Because it's not so simple to say do not ratify. I don't know whether there is a majority to ratify or not. We don't know yet, because we start the scrutinizing work right at this moment in the Parliament, but also in the Council. And it's more complex than just saying yes or no. If you would ask my opinion today, and you would say, would you vote for the MERCOSUL free trade agreement? I would say not as it stands today. But if we see a possibility to do improvements that actually will make sure that on climate and the lives in Brazil will make a change, then maybe I can change my mind. And that is the exercise in front of us. And it's extremely important to stress that. For sure, as what I said about leadership and Europe on climate, that's clear. You cannot be a partner in trade without being a partner in climate. That goes without saying. And you should know the Commission, European Commission, always takes that as an argument. And it's not even a false argument, it's only just a partial argument, taking that argument by saying, look, because we have the free trade agreement negotiated between Europe and the MERCOSUL countries, because of that fact and the pressure that the European Commission put to Bolsonaro, you didn't leave the Paris Agreement like Trump did. And that's true. But is that enough? Of course not. But the Commission uses as an argument, which is something to take into account, uses as an argument, take the free trade agreement as a leverage to change. And that is, for me, the big question mark. Can we do that? Is that possible? Because everybody knows that in the FTA, there is a TSD chapter, that means the whole chapter on sustainability. And for me, that is not good enough. And as any TSD chapter, also the recent one on Canada, for instance, or the one we did with Singapore, is just not strong enough. And more important, it's not enforceable and it is not sanction based. So that is one of the key problems that are lying ahead of us, because, and that you all know as well, trade is happening in any case. People in Europe are buying daily, or the farmers are buying daily a lot of products from Brazil that are directly inflicting and directly have an impact on the deforestation today, as it stands today, without an FTA. So the question is, again, I don't have the answer yet, but that's the process that we will walk the next months to come, and I hope all together with you, because it doesn't make any sense just to look at Europe. It's something that we have to do together with civil society in Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay. for sure. So it's not just from the European point of view. And I want to outline two things that might be a possibility to look forward. And it also connects to what Anna Cavazzini told you. The question is it possible to open up the agreement on the TSD chapter? That would be my preferred way of dealing. Putting the MERCOSUL agreement as an exemplar, an agreement that puts the example of the new generation of TSD chapters that are as enforceable as any other chapter of the FTA. Question mark. The Commission is really reluctant to do so. And I don't know whether we will have the support of the Council or the support of a majority in the European Parliament to do so, but it's one of the ways. The other way is to start working with pre-ratification conditions. That will mean the Parliament is only willing to ratify, to vote in favor, if we have guarantees. I heard a lot of you from the Brazilian side, all of you, all three of you, saying Bolsonaro will never, ever, ever change his mind on climate. And I agree on that. The question is, can we force him? And for me, that is the key question. Can we force him to do so? And then you have to make a connection between the pre-ratification conditions and what Anna told you, for instance, on due diligence. But also the Commission will come up next year with a horizontal proposal on deforestation in Europe, but also in the rest of the world. Will that be a powerful instrument? And can we force Brazil to underline, to go ahead with that deforestation initiative before we are ready to make any attempt for ratification? So you see, I'm a politician that has, I work value-based, but I'm also pragmatic. Because if it's just saying no to the agreement will not improve the lives of the Brazilians. I'm absolutely sure of that. It will not improve your life. And Bolsonaro will have the ideal scapegoat saying these Europeans, they're crazy and they're whatever, because I don't think he really fundamentally cares. But good trade agreements based on real values, also on human rights, can have a leverage to improve the conditions in the world, and I hope also of the people living in Brazil. But I know a lot of question marks, but we're at the beginning of a democratic process that we will walk together, I hope, the next months to come. And normally we would have visited Brazil in May. Of course, we had to stay home, all of us, but there will be an opportunity to see each other, and I'll make sure that when the European Parliament comes, well, the delegation, not the whole Parliament, when a delegation comes, that we will take time to have discussions with the civil society. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Kathleen, thank you very much for, sorry, I have to switch to English. Thank you very much for your presentation and a very clear message, but also reminding us that there are also other countries in Latin America that we should also focus, because they are also being affected by this agreement, and also reminding us that with our Green New Deal here in Europe, we have to also acknowledge that we are not isolated in an island, that we have also to our policies here are linked also to not only agreement, but what we are doing here has an impact also in other countries and other regions, and also showing us that how we can strategically use the agreement, not only to say no, but maybe to use for also improvements. I think this is always the strategy between also the civil society organizations, say no or try to improve what is there. And I think this is important at least to think about and to see what we can do. Thank you very much for your comments on this. In the original planning of this meeting, we would now go to questions. But luckily, we have two additional special guests that announced their participation in this event, and that I would like to give the floor also for some awards. The first is Marina Silva, and I'm extremely happy to have her here with us. Although perhaps not all of us know her personally, we have all been influenced by her personal and political work for the Amazonian region and the environment in general over the past decades. The murder of Chico Mendes many decades ago, with whom Marina worked closely, has motivated many people to become politically involved. The foundation of many organizations in Brazil and abroad, which are still active today, such as Climate Alliance, can be traced back to the commitment of Chico Mendes and Marina Silva. In early years, she founded the independent trade union movement with rubber tapper leader Chico Mendes in the state of Acre, and helped to establish the Chico Mendes Reserve, which was an important milestone on the concept of conservation through the use of natural resources, which was a new concept at the time. She was the first rubber tapper ever elected to Brazil's Federal Senate. And as a native Amazonian senator, Silva built support for environmental protection of the reserves, as well as for social justice and sustainable development in the Amazon region. From 2003 to 2008, she served as Minister of Environment under Lula's first government and is recognized as one of the key architects of the successful policies for reduction in Amazon deforestation. She resigned because of dissatisfaction with the environmental policy of Lula, who has pushed through many major projects, including the Belo Monte Dam. She joined the Green Party in 2010 and was a presidential candidate. With over 20 million votes, she was one of the top 3 candidates and forced a second election round. In 2013, she founded the party Rede, Sustainable Network, and ran for Rede as presidential candidate in 2018. Her commitment without compromise for the environment and the Amazonia, but especially to the people who live from and with the environment, is an important example and inspiration for us. So Marina, we are very happy to have you here today, and I hope you can join now with some comments on what you heard before.
Muito obrigada, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm very happy to be here, to be able to participate in this debate. I would like to say hello to my Brazilian colleagues, and their discourse is very accurate, well described the situation in Brazil and the need, our need to find a path out of this crisis we're living. Hello to all of the people and organizations organizing this event. Thank you to the parliamentarians who just spoke as well. Very quickly, I would like to say the following. Brazil, as has been said earlier, as my friend said, is going through a situation that is really difficult. We have the combination of 3 crises. We have a public health crisis. We have more than 40,000 people that passed away. We have more than 800,000 infected people. We have a terrible economic crisis that we're dealing with, and we have a terrible political institutional crisis created by the government itself, a government that does not respect the Constitution and is threatening our democracy, as has been said before. So we have 3 crises we're dealing with: health crisis, economic and social crisis, and a political and institutional crisis. Maybe in no other place in the world we have a situation comparable to the one we are going through now in Brazil. And that means there is a big danger for the Brazilian society. But those that are most threatened are the most vulnerable. The poor communities in the big urban sprawls, women, and especially the native indigenous populations. Those are the ones that are most suffering threats of violence that they suffer from, murders that they are being threatened with, murders that are happening. And as they have a different immunological built than other people do, the virus has a different impact or a worse impact on the indigenous populations, but also the logging, the mining, the occupation, the illegal occupation of their territories are a threat to them. As we have heard earlier, our current government is hostile to the indigenous populations and against environmental protection. And the government of Bolsonaro lives climate denial and at the same time denies the reality of the corona pandemic. In this context, we have to discuss the MERCOSUL European Union free trade agreement. First of all, we have to realize that this agreement before the pandemic was something totally different from this agreement after the agreement. Even before the pandemic, it was important to include social and environmental clauses to oblige the authorities that indigenous communities could participate in these debates and in the conception of the agreement. This is an ethical imperative. This agreement needs to be worked on, and even more so now in this new reality. And that is something that Brazil and the world has to realize. So if people are thinking of restarting the economic, commercial trade, we have to agree on sustainability. The Paris Agreement is very important. These aims are important, but they are even more important now with these new paradigms. So therefore, we should not think that in 6 months we can solve Brazil's problems that have been increasing at a scary rate. And I would like to mention a few issues. In 6 months, we will not be able to solve the problems. And this agreement needs to be looked at in regard to the environmental clauses. They have to be even stricter now than earlier. So we have to discuss new criteria. A system of certification of a deforestation-free supply chain has to be part of the agenda. We have to be able to know where these produces originate from, that there is no violence, no illegal land occupation, no illegal deforestation, no human rights abuses at the root of these supply chains. That is not a binding clause in the agreement yet. Another important aspect is that MERCOSUL and the European Union create a formula to be able to quantify how much CO2 is being imported and exported. When you are exporting beef, soy, or whatever, or when you're importing to Brazil, you have to have a possibility to quantify the CO2 emitted in the production of these products. That is a new reality we have to face in this world. It is fundamental that we don't succumb to the illusion that the Bolsonaro government will listen to the appels, to the calls made. On the other hand, the Brazilian civil society should not be mixed up with the government. You should not take the Brazilians for the government. Brazilians have an agenda, and Brazil has proved that it can induce change. When I was a minister, that was mentioned earlier, we created a plan that reduced deforestation by deforestation. We created many hectares of indigenous reserves and territories. We reduced the CO2 emissions. We proved that public policies can lead to the reduction of deforestation and the emission of CO2, and that economic growth and environmental protection can go hand in hand, but not with this government. So you have to suspend ratification of this agreement until big changes have been made. Let us create an agenda, things that have to be dialogued and discussed, and make sure that these demands be made clear in the agreement. Otherwise, if not with this government, ratify the treaty with a different government, because after ratifying this agreement, you will not be able to change the Brazilian government, the policies of the Brazilian government. The results of environmental policies of the current Brazilian government are more deforestation than even last year. The results of the current policies is that there is an increase of violence against the indigenous population in Brazil. So we have to listen to civil society, we have to listen to scientists, we have to listen to enterprises that don't agree, to commerce that doesn't agree with Bolsonaro's politics. And I would like to close with the following words. Don't adhere to the illusion that by ratifying this this treaty, you will oblige the government to do what has to be done, what needs to be done. We need to open an agenda. We need to discuss with the indigenous populations. We need to discuss with people responsible, with civil society, with the Brazilian society, to make sure that this treaty is worked upon in front of the eyes of this world suffering from this global pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marina, for these clear words and your participation. I think it's clear that we need dialogue. This is what we are trying to do, and to include the different actors in the discussion process, to exchange the ideas and strategies, and see and analyze what we can do to support the Brazilian organization, civil society, but also what we can do here in Europe. So thank you very much for your clear words. I would like now to give the floor to our second special guest, which is Joênia Wapichana. She is a Brazilian congresswoman, the first indigenous woman elected to the Chamber of Deputies and the second indigenous federal deputy since the election of Mário Juruna in 1982. She was also the first indigenous lawyer in Brazil. After taking a land dispute to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, Wapichana became the first indigenous lawyer to argue before the Supreme Court of Brazil. She is the current president of the National Commission for the Defense of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and a member of the Wapichana tribe of northern Brazil. I had the opportunity and the pleasure to meet her last year when we were in Manaus with our fair on renewable energies, where she participated. I heard that she is now here in the event, so I would like to give her the floor for some comments. Joenia, can you talk to us?
Thank you, Thomas. Obrigada a todos e a todas.
Thank you to everyone. I'm going to be speaking in Portuguese, and I want the indigenous leaders participating in this meeting to be able to understand me. I will join my Brazilian colleagues with the worries that I have. Our responsibility towards the indigenous people, towards Brazil, and it is a shared responsibility. The indigenous people have contributed to the world and taking care of the ecosystem, protecting the rich biodiversity in the Amazon. This is a crisis that we had not been able to foresee, a public health crisis, and the indigenous populations have been taking care of the environment for us. And we have a responsibility towards them. But maybe we should also listen to their knowledge. For example, traditional medical knowledge from the indigenous populations that might help us and that we should be aware of. And I would like to agree with what Marina Silva just said. Thank you, Marina Silva. Dear Marina Silva, our priorities really have to be to confront these crises, the health crisis, the economic crisis, the political crisis that we're going through. As a leader of the same political party that Marina belongs to, as speaker for this party, we have big priorities regarding the COVID-19 crisis. But at the same time, we should not forget other issues as well. There are issues that are interrelated to the corona crisis. The civil society going out on the street against the law MP 910 so that territories in the Amazon be protected. And we need the Brazilian society to involve itself, to be part of discussion in public, open discussions regarding these issues amidst a pandemic, amidst of this crisis. And this is really a cruelty that we're going through. The indigenous population is under threat, is under attack of this Bolsonaro government. And instead of strengthening control, being more efficient, protecting the indigenous territories against attack, against deforestation, against lumbers, against gold miners. All the contrary, what we're seeing is a destructuration, is a destruction of the public policies that were in place to protect the indigenous populations and the environment. And along with all these issues, we have the pandemic. We were hoping that people would hold on to social distancing, but all the contrary. The invasions did not stop. All the contrary, there are more people entering the indigenous territories. The territories are under attack. The vulnerable populations, the Yanomamis in the state I live in Roraima, for example, are saying that the attacks, the invasions have multiplied. And the pandemic was, by the government, called as a possible solution to these issues. And it will be a big issue to see how we are going to get through this crisis. We need answers to health issues, to economic issues, to the protection of the most vulnerable, the protection of human rights, the protection of the indigenous populations. Human rights are being cut very, very quickly. There's a lot of pressure. The indigenous territories are under threat. And if we had a progressive government in Brazil that was a democratic government that had the intention of protecting the indigenous populations, but what we're seeing right now is exactly the opposite, a government that is attacking democracy, that is destroying the democratic structures we have, Parliament, Supreme Court, other institutions that we have. I mean, 2 days ago, there was this proposition to shut down the Supreme Court. So that makes the situation of the most vulnerable communities even more difficult, even more fragile. And we are ready to discuss, even though we are a minority, though we are in the opposition, we have more people joining in our rows. And I think we have to follow this strategy of having the population discuss, be part of the political process. We have to encourage the indigenous communities to join in. I think the webinar we're having here right now is extremely important. We have to support the indigenous leaders, and we have to make sure to protect life. We have to stop the Bolsonaro policies. We're asking for his impeachment, and we hope that society is understanding that he has passed the limits of absurdity. We have propositions in Congress, in Senate. Every week we try, our party tries to fight against these atrocities committed by the government. We try to be a real opposition to his policies, and we really need to support the civil society. And I think the European Parliament needs to support us as well, and needs to support these aims as well. You need to support, and you need to protect life. You need to protect the demands of the indigenous people, the most vulnerable people, to make sure that the indigenous communities will not be decimated due to this pandemic, due to this disease. There needs to be a control, there needs to be a protection, a fiscalization. Brazilian politics have to change to support these communities, to strengthen these communities, and stop the invasions And then the coronavirus came on top of these political attacks that we're having. But let us all be aware, and in Europe, you have to be aware. I know that you can help us and support us. Please make sure to safeguard our democracy, to safeguard the indigenous territories, safeguard human life. And we have to stop these irresponsible policies, and we have to make sure that the international agreements are responsible as well, because we in Brazil are asking for your support to protect human rights here. We need to have a conversation, a responsible conversation. And the phase we're going through right now in Brazil right now has not even reached its peak yet. But I think we need your help from now on to be able to take upon these responsibilities to defend human rights, for everyone, and obviously for the indigenous population as well. Thank you once again for the invitation, and I'm very happy to see that we have this global connection, organizations, NGOs, support on a global level. There are more than 40,000 people, Marina, is that the number you said, who have been passed away? And we want to make sure that we protect indigenous lives. There is the law 1142 that we have just proposed in Congress, but even if Congress agrees on this law that protects health, I'm sure that Bolsonaro will stop this law, and we have to realize that this is really an emergency that we're going through, the indigenous populations, the quilombolas, and we need to gather every support we have for these populations.
Clear words and also clear information on what you are doing in the parliament, and also the request how we can support you and the civil society organizations in Brazil. And I think what we started today, maybe it's a first step for a more permanent conversation and dialogue about this situation, not only now. And I think it's clear that we are in a sort of permanent crisis, and I think this needs also a permanent dialogue and conversation. So thank you very much for your words. And we are now formally at the end of our meeting, but I would like to ask who is interested in for some additional questions and comments that we can extend some 10 minutes more. If you agree that we can at least have some additional words, I would like also at the end to hear our indigenous partners so that they can give us some comments on what they have heard. Now I would like to give some space for Maria Laura from Human Rights Watch from Brazil to give some comments on this. Maria.
Pode me ouvir? Muito obrigada.
Estamos ouvindo.
Ótimo. Muito obrigada pela oportunidade de falar.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. Many of the issues I wanted to talk about have already been talked about by my other Brazilian colleagues, but I wanted to make sure that to remind you Europeans that this crisis in the Amazon is not only an environmental crisis, it's a crisis of justice, it's a crisis of human rights. The deforestation is led by criminal networks, violent criminal networks that are threatening, that are intimidating, that are killing those who are protecting the forest. As for instance, the indigenous populations, but also the members of the agencies that were created to protect our forests, that they too are going through a dismantling right now, and they are in a risk situation. So we have to remember this human rights crisis. Another element I wanted to mention very quickly is that this is a crisis that demands immediate action. We have to act now. We have to put pressure. Europe has to put pressure on Brazil now. You can't wait for the next government. Bolsonaro is dismantling everything we have here. He is going back on every treaty, on the Paris agreements, and now is the moment to put pressure on the government and not wait until later. And therefore we have a message that we've tried to spread throughout the world with our Brazilian partners. So do not ratify this agreement. Don't even consider ratifying this agreement while Brazil still has this government. The government institutions have to respect human rights, which is not the case. More than 300 people have been assassinated under this government, and only 14 people have been taken to court on these issues. We need concrete answers. We need less violence. We need a protection of the indigenous populations. We need a protection of the indigenous territories. We need a reduction of the deforestation, which in Brazil right now is reaching a high point. So I would like to talk to you or ask you, members of the European Parliament, do not even consider ratifying this agreement if Brazil does not respond immediately. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this message of urgency. I think the message is clear, and I think this is what we will then, after also this meeting, debate also here with our network partners to see how what urgent actions we can take in this regard. So I would like now to because this was some of the questions that we have in the Q&A session were to our indigenous partners, asking them how they see this discussion about the MERCOSUL agreement, but also some clear proposals of how what we can do here, for example, in regards to actions or petitions for companies that are buying products from with deforestation, and also, as Marina said, not only deforestation but also with CO2 emissions in the products. So how we can work on this. Maybe some comments from Kreta and Dinamam on this. Hello. Yeah, I don't know if you are still there, Kreta. Are you still there?
Sim.
Okay.
Sim, tô aqui. Então.
Yes, I'm right here. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have conditions to fight this situation by ourselves, on our own. If there are international agreements being signed now, that has adverse effects on us. I was asked one of these days what we indigenous people thought about this agreement, this free trade agreement, and I said, we get the impression that Europe doesn't know what it wants. Europe has to know what they want. That would be, this free trade agreement would be financing the war against us Obviously, Europe is not the only market. North America and Asia buys products from here as well. But there's a strong connection between this South American continent and Europe, which goes back to colonization. And for how long do you want to colonize and enslave our continent? Until when do you think your governments, your parliamentarians, your businesses will continue extracting our resources? And until when do we, indigenous people of Brazil, traditional communities in Brazil, the poorest, the minorities in Brazil, the small farmers, until when will our blood serve your interests? Until when will we continue losing our territories? Europe has to rethink its economic policies in regard to Latin America. And I'm not only talking about Brazil, it's all of Latin America. Also with other continents, obviously, as Africa, for example, continents that Europe has a responsibility for, that Europe has been enslaving. And until when do you intend to do that? For the last 520 years, Europe has invaded Latin America, has usurped our rights, our territories, enslaved us. So what do you want in Europe? What does Europe want? We know what we want. We Brazilian indigenous people know what we want. We want our territories protected. We want an intact environment to live in. We want a live planet full of biodiversity that our territories offer to the rest of the world. That is what we want. And now Europe has to know what you want. And this is how I would like to close. And thank you once again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Kreta, for these clear words and reminding us that it's important that we clarify what we want and how we want to combine environment, climate, human rights, and all these topics for a holistic approach. So we are finalizing the meeting, but maybe Dinamam want to say some final words. Dinamam, are you still there? To be discussed. I think we should come to the end of this meeting. I think this is my impression that we will have the opportunity for additional meetings in the future. Like Marcio proposed to create a permanent conversation for these topics, and I think many expressed also this wish to continue in a dialogue, in a conversation, to look into the different aspects of the situation, which is not a new problem. I think it's also become clear that what we are facing now is not a new problem, but it's been aggravated by a policy that is anti-democratic, racist, and against the democracy. And with such a policy, it's very difficult to act. But on the other side, we saw also many ideas what we can do here in Europe to continue the discussion, but also supporting our indigenous partners, the civil society in general in Brazil, but also in the other countries. So thank you very much for the participation in this event. I want to finalize saying thanks to our translators. So thank you very much for being here for this huge work of translation to Portuguese and English. Also to our panelists from Brazil, from our MEPs, Marina Silva, Joenia, and all the participants. Marcio, thank you very much for your participation. Kreta, Dinamam. I think it was very important, this discussion. Thank you also thank you very much for Truls, for Rainforest Foundation Norway, for co-organizing this meeting, for the Organization for Society for Threatened People. Thank you all for our colleagues behind the scenes for organizing all the technical issues. I hope that we can continue this dialogue as mentioned, and I hope that we can continue our networking with all the organizations. Wish you a good day, a good evening, and hope for future conversations and strategic discussions. So thank you very much for all of you, and all the best, and keep safe and healthy. Thank you. Bye-bye. Obrigado, Kreta. Obrigado, Marcio, todos que estão aí, colegas brasileiros. Tudo de bom para vocês e esperamos continuar com o nosso diálogo e esperamos ver como podemos apoiar vocês. Tudo de bom. Boa
Valeu,
tarde.
beleza?
Boa noite.
Obrigado.
Okay.
Okay, here we are.
Again, some minutes more, but I think it was important also to give the floor to Marina Silva and Joenia. I think this was important political support for this dialogue.
Yeah. So Johanna and Magdalena, thank you so much for spending more time with us and even doing more translation. It was really great to have you with us.
It was great. It was an honor to be with you. I hope it was helpful.
It was, totally.
Okay, good. So you were able to understand. I'm glad.
Yeah.
And we'll be in touch, I'm sure. I'm sure you have things to discuss now amongst yourselves, and we will let you be. But I look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Take care.
Magdalena.
Good
Thank
luck.
you, Joanne.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Okay. So yeah, we have loads of open questions, and people also asking if at least we send the question to the people. Maybe we can find a way how to include it. I think we should contact the participants again and thank them. And on the other hand, trying to at least answer some of the questions later.
Yeah, that would be brilliant if that's possible. It was very many good questions that came in that we didn't have sort of time to attend to, but I think it was a right prioritization still of time to let them speak.
Yeah, because I also saw the people leaving, and so I thought before we have only 2 or 3 participants, we should end the meeting, although not all questions have been answered. And I think, yeah, because of this